The history of Queens football is golden. We've been playing football here since 1882, and the great players and great teams and memories, 30 conference championships, 8 national championships, 3 Grey Cups.
I love to tell the story because most people don't know that Queens actually won 3 Grey Cups.
It was a small school in a small city, and by beating the big city, it was huge. I don't think players in that team ever bought a meal or ever had to buy a beer if they drank.
It's kind of neat to think that this city had 3 Grey Cup championship teams. The fact that they were from Queens is interesting, but as a Kingstonian, you take pride in that just the same.
The Grey Cup started in 1909 by Governor General Gray, who actually wanted to donate a trophy for amateur hockey. It became the Allen Cup, so it was decided that the Grey Cup was going to rugby champion, football rugby champion.
It's a very historical, significant trophy in Canada. Canadians, even if they're not football fans, always watch the Grey Cup on Sunday.
The Grey Cup is the great unifier of our country, and I think even post-World War I is when it really became the great unifier, and that is when the East started playing the West challenger for the Grey Cup.
19 and 20, when they started playing after the war, were pretty lousy years. In fact, they were appalling.
The winter 1919, you're getting into early 1920. Well, the first thing you're going to notice is the lack of men, the lack of young men in particular, because the bloodbath of the First World War impacts Canada, but also a place like Kingston. You're going to see a lot of men with no arms, no legs, men being pushed because their lungs have been burned to pieces by the mustard gas. You're going to notice people wearing masks, just like we are today. And 60, 70% of all hospital admissions in Kingston, Ontario during this period are related to the Spanish flu, because Kingston has the highest per capita death rate of any community in the entire country from the Spanish flu. So it's a very unsettled time for both Kingston and the entire country. And Queens basically goes bankrupt because of a lack of students, because the whole cream of the crop of that generation, they're over in France and Belgium. And Queens, like I said, its enrollment drops 65% in that period. So it's a crushing financial blow.
The 1919 season was a disaster for Queens. They didn't win a game. They were outscored badly. 1920 was a little bit better, but not much. Queens itself was struggling financially, and they had to raise money to stay afloat.
Queens is able to, at this time, raise $1 million. That's a huge amount of money, and they saved the university.
They realized that the football program was a bit of a flagship that would keep them, if they were successful, would keep them top of mind amongst Canadians, and it would make it easier to recruit good students to Queens. The football program was really a recruiting vehicle, and no better way to recruit than to be successful.
There is stories that they gave benefits to the players. They may have paid them a little bit to come to Queens.
It was legal to be paid, although everyone paid lip service to the fact that they were supposedly amateurs. But in reality, everybody knew that people were paying people to play.
To get into that game, you had to spend money, just like U of T and McGill were. Players were encouraged with financial incentives to come to Queens, and it really paid dividends in 1922.
They certainly were interested in finding as many, let's say, semi-pro guys as they could get their hands on. The first one that they found was a guy named Batstone, Harry Batstone.
You know, Harry Batstone coming to Queens, the analogy I would use would be almost Gretzky going to the LA Kings. I mean, one player can make that big of a difference.
He was in 5 Grey Cups in a row. I think he's the only player in the history to play in 5 in a row. Sort of like when you think about LeBron James now, he's done all those NBA finals in a row with different teams. Batstone was with the Argos in 1920, won it in 21 at the Grey Cup, and with Queens in 1922, 23, and 24. So he was a star.
He made a heck of a difference when he came at 22. He continued to make a contribution to Queens football. He coached a couple of the championship teams in 27 and in 29 again. Batstone was the coach for both of those things. He also got a medical degree at Queens and he stayed around Kingston the rest of his life. So Harry Batstone made a sizable contribution to Queens football when he came as a player and then afterwards both as a coach and later on.
So they brought Harry Batstone, they got Pep Ledley, they had their quarterback was Johnny Evans, one of the great quarterbacks of Queens history. They had Gib McKelvey, along with, I think Gib had 3 or 4 brothers or family members. The McKelvey brothers were very good, and then Bud Thomas was another top player. They brought in Billy Hughes, he had been at McGill. He was the top coach at the time. He was able to recruit the best guys.
It was a shocker that the Blues beat them. So it forced a playoff, and then the next week, Queens turns around and beats Toronto.
Queens came back out on fire and won the next game and the game after that and never looked back.
They beat the Argos in the East Final on a last-second field goal. Pip Ledley kicked the last-second field goal for them to advance. And then they played Edmonton in the Grey Cup Final, and it was hosted in Kingston. First time Kingston ever hosted it at Richardson Stadium at Queens.
To get the West here for the Grey Cup games, the Eastern teams had to subsidize travel. Even though a couple years before, Queens was struggling financially and had to raise over $1 million just to stay afloat, in 1922, it was no problem to raise money to bring the Elks to Kingston to play Queens. Queens saw this as an athletic accomplishment, but also as a marketing tool to keep Queens on the front page of the newspapers across the country.
Edmonton came in, they were winning 1-0 after the halftime. Apparently Queens had gone in really confident, overconfident, hadn't practiced a lot, and so it came out and played a really poor first half.
2 particular players that would have stood out in that game, Harry Batstone and Johnny Evans at quarterback. Both of them were Canadian All-Stars in that year.
Then got it together at halftime and then dominated in the second half and scored 13-0. Led by Ledley's kicking and running, and they end up winning the game 13-1.
To win that first Grey Cup against the Edmonton Elks at home in Kingston, incredible.
This was a huge deal for Kingston. What followed after winning the Grey Cup was parades and celebrations and parties.
They were given the keys of the city. They were given the first version of a Grey Cup ring. They were really the toast of the town.
Rolling into 1923, it was anticipated that the team would repeat.
The 1923 team was by far the most dominant Queens team. They had all their players back from the previous year in 22, Harry Batstone and Pep Ledley, and led by Johnny Evans again. They were 6-0. They outscored their opponents 137-19 throughout the season.
Queens did not disappoint. They won all their games that year. The championship game was against the Regina Rough Riders.
Queens was really driving a point home to the West. Don't bring that stuff here.
Queens dominated the game on the scoreboard and on the field. They ran up and down the field all over Regina.
It would have been much more of a run-oriented football game. The development of the forward pass was extremely limited and hadn't really reached its way up here yet.
And back in those days, the rule was, and this comes from rugby, is that when you score, you had the option to kick off to the other team or get the kickoff to you. So Queens kept scoring, and then they would get Regina to kick off to them, and then Queens would score again. And if you look at the box score, every single quarter, they scored a ton of points against Regina. So Regina basically's defense was on the field the whole game, and Queens was just running them ragged. And so they were tired. By the second half, Regina had nothing left, and Queens just kept running up the score.
The dominant performance of the 1923 team, 54-0 in a Grey Cup championship, is remarkable.
To this day, the 54-0 score in that Grey Cup game is still a record. May never be broken. Johnny Evans was the quarterback that literally ran the show and handed the ball off to Ledley and Batstone.
He got 2 touchdowns. He had a good game. It was nice that would have been his last game for Queens.
The leadership qualities are the thing that really shone through for Evans back then. He was the guy that made the Queen's Golden Gales go.
The Most Valuable Player award at Queen's is known as the Johnny Evans Memorial Award, and it's given every year to the most valuable player on any athletic team at the university.
Johnny Evans was from Kingston, tough as nails, a great athlete, again, a dual sport athlete.
He studied medicine at Queen's. When he graduated, he went and played a year with the Hamilton Tigers because he was interning in Hamilton. He had a tragic accident. His car went into a canal up in Sault Ste. Marie, and he drowned. He was found when the car was pulled up to be in the back seat with the doors all locked and the car in gear. Whether Evans had something in his personal life that caused him issues or what, it was nonetheless a very tragic end to a guy who was a very good university athlete and a very fine guy.
The 1924 team, again, just kept on rolling. Billy Hughes had built such a great bench and a great depth on that team. Billy Baldwin was the backup quarterback the previous years. He stepped in when Johnny Evans moved on and didn't miss a beat. Harry Batstone was still there and Pep Ledley was there.
They had a lot of depth, and of course they still had Batstone and Ledley. They're the story, okay, in football during this period, particularly Ledley, who could drop kick the ball, he could run it, he could do all kinds of stuff.
Ledley was the outstanding punter and a place kicker, and that made a huge difference in the game then. There was no forward passes, it was running and kicking. He also had 4 Grey Cup touchdowns over that span when they won, which was a record at the time to score in each of those games. So he was scoring by kicking and he was scoring by touchdowns.
Yeah, he's a fascinating man, Pep Ledley. Very quiet, very shy sort of guy. Did engineering at Queen's. Went to Hamilton, played professionally for a number of years, did very well. And then he came back to Queen's and he worked for quite a number of years as an engineer.
I think it goes back to Billy Hughes, their coach, who was able to keep this group together for the most part.
In the playoffs, they were able to beat Hamilton, who had Johnny Evans starring for the Hamilton Tigers. That game was all about their defense dominating Johnny Evans and controlling him. It's interesting when teams play their quarterback that they practiced against for all those years, right? So they had ball possession and defense controlled Evans and never allowed the Tigers to get in the game.
The West decided not to challenge for the Grey Cup that year.
Winnipeg was the champion in the West. They couldn't get an agreement to which railway to come out on. When they couldn't get the contract settled, they just decided they weren't going to come.
And so the final game against Toronto turned out to be the Grey Cup game.
So in that championship game against Toronto Balmy Beach, it was a closely fought game. Queens ended up winning 11-3, not a high scoring game, so it was a closely fought defensive struggle.
Batstone and Ledley were the 2 outstanding players that pretty much made this Grey Cup run possible.
So it was almost like a dynamic duo came to Queens. A couple of players can make a huge difference, especially when they're 2 best players in the country.
And the reality is Queens wouldn't have probably won those championships without Ledley and Batstone playing the way they did.
In the 1920s, it was huge.
It's a wonderful tonic to have Grey Cup champions right here in Kingston.
They had the heartbreak of 1 loss in that first season with the first Grey Cup, undefeated the next 2 seasons, which is a feat that is unmatched since.
It was the most successful time in the history of this program.
Over the total Grey Cups in those 3 years that they won, the points for and against were 78-4.
I don't suspect that particular point differential and score to ever be broken. 4 points over 3 years in a Grey Cup is really unheard of. That just showed how dominant they were to be able to score 78 points when you can only run the ball and kick the ball.
You look at what happened to those players after and what became of them. They were all successful people. These were people that were outstanding people off the field as well.
They're definitely up there for a dynasty. There's only 3 teams that have ever won 3 in a row and only 1 that's won 5 in a row. Queens is right up there. And the one thing with that team, in that 3-year stretch that they won, they were dominating most of their opponents, especially from a scoring perspective. They just dominated.
They must have been an interesting bunch of guys. To be at the university in the 1920s, when they finally got out from underneath the Spanish flu and the inheritance of the war, and finally got going, and they were winning these Grey Cups, and they were really good teams. It must have been a heck of a good time to be playing football at Queens.